Thank you all for coming. I have you all in a strip on the top, and I'm trying to figure out how to just put Lynn and me on the screen, but we'll just deal with it because we are speaking to each other and you will be eavesdropping on our conversation. Thank you. Okay, so Lynn and I are both former university professors, as you may know, who continue to teach writing. I write poetry and memoir and teach both, and Lynn writes novels and plays and teaches both, and we collaborate often on various projects and writing and presentations and have a wonderful time.
We have such a wonderful time that we're here tonight to celebrate Hilda's wonderful new collection, List and Story.
I'll hold it up.
Okay.
It's kind of pretty.
Yes, yes, it is. Oh, somebody else is holding it up. Good.
Okay.
Is this your first collection, Hilda, written entirely since you moved to New Mexico in 2010?
Well, not all the poems were written here. I brought some from Nebraska, but it's taken me 10 years to write this book, and we've been here for 9. So there are a few poems that came with me. And but the idea for the book was really a simple obsession with poems that are catalogs, lists, and poems that are narrative, stories. I love both those forms and work in them often. What I like about the list is that it seems open-ended. Give somebody a list, there's a poem. But a narrative poem seems closed, and I like them both.
I'm curious how you see this collection extending your body of work. Does it begin new explorations for you, either with craft or content or other?
Lynn, you got me. That's a great question. A critic said recently that she was interested in the fact that my lyrics seem in this book to have disappeared. And then she asked, is the lyric form itself a younger poet's game? And I was surprised because all of the materials of the lyric, that is nature, time, love, are right here. They're right in the book. But maybe it is that they're deconstructed. I don't know.
Well, I disagree that the lyric is a young person's game. We're always talking to audiences. We're always talking about love and all the things you mentioned. But I agree that in this book, we see lyric everywhere. Let's look at the first poem that you'll read, for example, which is called Transportation.
Thanks, Lynn. I realized that in all these years and all these books, I had never written about my father. And he was an interesting man. He left school at 12 to work for his mother, who owned a grocery store. So here's Transportation. My father bought a wagon to deliver groceries, then the shoe store's leathers, the mercantile's piles of rugs and towels, or anything else those neighbors needed, carried from one place to another. Then he got a truck, more trucks, and a terminal building, a phone and a typewriter and billing pads, and put his mother to work in the front office with an adding machine, a gas pump, and a motto: we move everything but the world. He bought a Packard, broke his back doing some fool thing in the alley, married Dolly, pretty but helpless, and over years moved the family from Harvard Street behind the skating rink to Highland Heights, in spite of covenants against Negroes, Italians, and Jews. Nobody ever stopped him. Somehow money piled up enough to keep his widow and child for many years, until the fleet of trucks and buildings with his name and motto in rolled gold stopped, were shuttered, sold. Where is he now? A sliver of bone and surge dug into a closed cemetery's dirt? Or reborn as some ambitious boy in Agra with a taxi ready to transport tourists and their stuff wherever they tell him to go, or wherever he wants them to go. And here's a survivor carrying stories from one life to another. Yours, readers.
Thank you, Hilda. I love how this poem ends with its invocation to the reader, sowing in the audience and broadening it far beyond you, the poet, and beyond the speaker of the poem.
Thanks, Lynn. I tried.
Many of your poems address women and writers. One in particularly that captivates me is called One Toe Crooked, which invokes fairy tales of the powerful crone and the generative young woman. There's also, you'll see, a reference to Hansel and Gretel in this poem, which I'm going to read now, on page 28 for those of you who have your books. One toe crooked. Let me tell you how it is with me, a bad back, spine like a snakeskin shed in the shadow of a pinelet, weakened innards, a liver fit for soup, and a brain the size of a lintel. The worst is the one toe, crooked like a staff carried too long by shepherds. One day, a fine mid-autumn with sun's eye full open against air's chill, I took to the woods to find my dinner. What with one thing and another, I swayed and shimmered my way along the path, gravel stuck to my knees from a fall, my felt shoes catching stones. But still, I got to the gate where geese cross coming home from the pond. What would do me that night? I was one only, with an oven fit for a child with money, my prize. Each night I lit it with a faggot of willow and some wormwood leaves. It had an iron basket suspended over the fire, good for roasting corn and potatoes. Tonight I was hungry against the chill coming. No ice yet, that was full winter, but now a clutch of eggs to boil in the kettle. Truly then I saw a girl, lovely as a stalk of silver grain, come around a corner that an oak made with my barn wall. She carried a bundle squirming like a peck of tadpoles and clutched to her chest a stack of books bound with a strap. She saw me as a wraith and ran. Was I a wraith? My toe hurt like hell, itself gaped open. But ectoplasm I wasn't, plain flesh. Still, she was afraid. Then I could see her babe's mouth open, its cries louder with each bounce, the flannel it was bound with coming loose. As I watched, standing bent over my toe, she dropped the books, the belt around them opened. Pages fanned out on the ground like parchment put to flame. What did all this mean in the daylight? The girl, her babe, the lost books cascading, and over everything pain ascending, covering our light, all that hope. The future somehow gone dark as a cavern. I bent over the mess, began to gather it up.
Thanks, Lynn. Don't you think that writing slows us down? The act of writing slows us down and makes us focus on tiny details. I wanted to show every single detail in that poem through the crone's eyes. Is she hallucinating the girl who appears? Does she want to eat the baby in that wonderful stove that she loves so much? Well, I thought, no, contrary to stereotype, she gathers up the books, not the baby. On the other hand, I wanted to push contrary to stereotype so that she might gather up the baby who represents the future, after all, nature, or the books, culture. And we represent culture. Or is it that we represent nature? Or are they all one and the same thing? Alternative mappings of life.
Well, she gathers the pages, history or herstory.
You bet.
She becomes an archivist, as the old always are.
I think so. I think so.
Another evocative poem looking at women writers is called Women in Poetry, which is based on the gender dynamic in your own classroom and our need for approval from male poets as women.
Boy, the first time I taught that seminar, I was terrified. And what's more, you know, I had to write the poem called Women in Poetry. I had no choice. But it wasn't until quite a long time after I'd written the poem that I found the final couplet for this poem. And then just last year, when I found Sigrid Nunez's wonderful novel, The Friend, did I find the epigraph. So it's been in progress for a long time. And I think there are some of the distinguished poets who were once my students who might be here. And some of them might have taken this seminar, Women in Poetry. Here's the epigraph. Among all my desires at the time, one of the strongest was to put my full trust in someone, in some man. They want to be told what's what by a man. Women at the north end of the table, nodding together. One so newly married, she writes as if the poem is her writing hand, lonely for the ring. I wanted to be told what's lovely by a man, as I was by my famous teacher who taught women, especially the beauty seated on his right to incite riot. Her pain seemed an ars poetica, her poem's all-naked body, enticingly sensual, flushed in sun and shower, come from the pool in stanza 1 to become in stanza 2 an erect and threatening penis in a changing room shared by a man and a girl. Was she the child? We wondered. What difference to the poem? In my class, we sat together in a darkening room late afternoon. I am trying to love poetry as a stay against confusion. Flesh for now, a stay against death, as lightning, incipient storm with its causal gods, breaks closer to morning. And now I write alone in the kitchen with only that growl to push me. No man's voice here, no transformation, only poetry. And I do want to say that Robert Frost, that I'm trying to love poetry as a stay against confusion is from Robert Frost. And the note is in the book. It's such a powerful line. I just used it. Okay.
Well, I think that last line, no man's voice here, no transformation, only poetry, sounds like your life's work to be able to please yourself as a poet.
It'd be hard for me to say what that line means, but it is what I wanted to bring the poem close. And yeah, there it is. There it is.
I'm a member of a peer writing group with you, and many of these poems I first read there. When you and I collaborated on the order of this collection, I felt such a sense of astonishment and a reflected pride about how this volume came together and how the poems become larger as they are set into the montage of the others.
What fun we had. But you know, as I'm looking forward, I'm thinking, what about collaboration? There's a poem called Collaboration in List and Story that documents another one unnamed. And isn't life a collaboration, especially these days of trying to survive COVID-19? Looking forward, I like to push the idea of personae interacting in the poem. And maybe because Lynn and I collaborate regularly, and because Lynn, you're a novelist. But wouldn't it be fun, and that word fun is one of Lynn's words, to generate several voices interacting the way you do in a novel? The long poem in here called The Spa of the Three Widows begins to engage that idea. It was an experiment for me, that's for sure.
Others in the collection too do this, sometimes a dialogue of objects, as in 6 objects in a gold foil box. But the one I'd like to read next, and I hope this isn't against some rule that we're mentioning poems that we're not reading, but this means you'll just have to read them. The one I'd like to read now is the title poem of the volume. At the heart of the book is this poem, which is called List and Story, which to me is a culmination of many themes in your work: the death of your brother, the complications of marriage and divorce, the vulnerability of children and the young, the frailty and yet power of family. List and Story is on page 30. Part 1. First, we must go for flowers to the nursery. Spring is here. My heart speaks an utterance packed with many meanings, as the begonias have petals, some one color, some another, and all blending into that plant you chose for the hanging basket. My brother at 15 went to war. He was an infantryman, a photographer. He opened the camps with his fellows. Then he came home. He lived at home. He lived in his bedroom. He studied. He graduated. He married, and you know that story. Sons. At 40, he took up a gun into his mouth and pulled the trigger. He was in the woods where the bears go. He drove the old car. He didn't leave a note. He was gainfully employed. His sons, that utterance, and then peace. The red petals have fallen. The flushed petals remain. Leaves like steak knives, serrated, fleshy, the darkest green. We go to the garden with our children. We have graduated. We have married. The garden is our pleasure and utterance. Marriage, that pleasure. The making of food, the making of the yolk and white of one egg, the whirling of the mobile under which we make our children. Such pleasure moves. Let us tear the garden into ribbons. Let us transplant the white daffodils with their bonnets that bend backward. Let us move the magnolia corms. Let us divide the bulbs and the peonies. Who will take the children? I will. I will. Part 2. Who let the monster into the house? Who cooks the food for him, shops, plays the flute, drives the tumbrils? Who folds into the hay blankets, drinks the red wine, wears the jewels? Who hangs the blade over the fireplace with its jeweled hilt, braided scabbard? Who watches the savaging of the children? Utterance. One child. Where were you to say no, leave a note, take up the gun? The body of the flowers in the hanging basket is multiple. Blue stars and anise, pansies and feverfew, the hanging vines of sweet potato. Its utterance is heavy, moving in wind, creaks. The children play in the garden, on the swings, in the sandbox. One carries a greasy bag in his fist, a slippery bottle of pop. They lock the door. They cavort on the rug, and it was evening. The monster reigns. Utterance, spring, summer, fall, winter, silence and the smell of balsam. Pastries that you roll out on the floor, shape into a log, apply frosting, display, bow, décolletage. And it was morning. The children under the tree, gifts and more gifts, the timbrels and bells, Bach and the great Germans, some candles, some fire. Who let the monster into the house with his axe, his dragged tree, sticky sap? Part 3. I slid down the shut door, locked it. I hit the floor, stopped. I wept. She thanked me, that child with blood on her cheek. She thanked me with her bruised tongue. She thanked me with her utterance and disappeared. Never again. Never again. Never again. And so forth. And it was morning, and it was evening of the 4th day. The basket was hanging on the porch in the heat of the day. In the night, in the cool garage with its lowered door, a moat between night and the house, lurking. That utterance. A gun. That utterance. Disbelief. That utterance, and in the house, the children. And now the story is over. Silence, penance, utterance, the page and the oranges, pears and wafers. 40 years in the desert of the sandbox where cats dig.
Thank you, Lynn. Thank you for that wonderful reading. That's a narrative poem for sure. The title poem, the skeleton of the book. Lynn, you and I share a common loss, losing a beloved brother.
Yeah, and our missing brothers appear often in both of our writing. Speaking as you did before of collaboration, let's read The Sisters together. The poem itself also collaborates with its retelling of a well-known fairy tale, The 12 Dancing Sisters.
When I was a child, I loved, it's called, I think, The 12 Dancing Princesses. I loved that fairy tale. And I think the reason I did was because my mother was one of a number of sisters, 4 sisters. And I grew up in a welter of aunts, all of whom I adored. But the great number of them was such a pleasure for me and my cousins. And in this poem, I imagine the sisters are old. But you know, what happened was as my mother's and her sisters grew old and their husbands died, they too lived together. So we'll begin with the sisters. Once there were 12 sisters who lived together. They were old now, within a decade of beyond old, but still they were alive.
They slept in a room they'd shared as children. Each had a life remembered, a beloved, pets, their own children who were cousins, who'd summered together at the beach each year with their papas, their mamas, their aunts.
Now the sisters were old. In the mornings they'd arise, put on cotton robes, pull cushions from under their beds to sit on. Each faced a window. Each had a bureau just big enough to hold treasures. Every morning they sat.
One morning, the sisters awoke with sore feet. Ouch, each complained. Nothing to be done. They looked for their shoes, found tatters. All day they went barefoot in the garden, in the kitchen, under stars. When they sat down on their beds before sleep, tired, Each found new shoes sparkled with sequins, sewn felt, treasures. Each sister lay down and slept.
Next morning, they awoke again with sore feet, their sparkly slippers again tatters. All day again, they went barefoot in the garden, in the kitchen, under stars. Then, time for bed. Surprise, each found sparkly slippers made of felt, some green, some gold, some purple or opal, and many other colors. They smiled at each other, lay down, and slept.
Years passed. The old sisters grew older. Their feet knurled and blistered. Piles of old shoes thrown out their windows into the backyard loam, like mementos of lives extinguished. Dogs came to sniff and dig. One dog, a noble beast, carried around a string of tatters in his mouth.
He seemed to dig when nobody watched him. Most of the time, he was invisible. The sisters slept more and more in light as well as darkness. In the air, a swirl of soft bells, the sounds of trumpet, rhubarb, and drum.
One midnight, the eldest sister opened her eyes. Surprise! Around her, a whirl of sisters. And the noble dog followed along behind, dragging his tatters. Each sister had a partner, a clattering bone bag, slender of wrist and ankle, waist and neck, who held her at wrist and waist. They swung as the dog leapt and wove himself into lacy ropes and shadows. Were you there? I was. I saw the sisters dance, the dog jump, the bones begin to flower.
Thanks, Lynn.
I love that poem, Hilda.
I'm so glad. I'm so glad.
That poem delights with its power of the sisters, the dozen women. I think we should end, Hilda, with one last lyric poem before we go to questions.
I'd be so happy to read the Vinci Moon, which is, you will all recognize where it's set, just where. It's on page 56. A little lyric. The Da Vinci Moon. The Da Vinci Moon is rising by Saturn, its pierced mate. They are lovely, a slipper moon, as my mother would say, thin as the edge of a mercury dime. Tonight, she is smiling, her sliver or slipper at the bottom of her face. Beloved paces in and out of rooms, looking from the windows at the sky west where the sun is making a rosy stripe at the horizon, then east at Our Lady Moon, smiling over the arroyo. Soon, when dark comes, rooms with their furniture will disappear. Out the window, the perimeter of the moon shows a chipped halo, or something else I can't say. I wanted to end this reading with silence because as writers, as speakers, as friends, and as family members, we all speak against silence. And yet the power of silence shapes and requires our writing, our work against it. So the power of silence, the bones flower, the sisters are dead. In this final poem, Mother is there, my mother is there, Dale is there, and the moon then as a mercury dime for us all to enjoy.
And it's set in twilight, which is always a particular time of silence, I think.
Absolutely, absolutely. Thank you so much, Lynn.
Thank you, Hilda.